You think you know Sleeping Beauty, the innocent fairy tale of a princess cursed to sleep until awakened by true love's kiss, a story you've shared with your children, watched in colorful animation, one that ends with the promise that good triumphs and love conquers all. But the Sleeping Beauty you know is a carefully constructed lie, a sanitized version deliberately engineered to conceal one of the darkest narratives ever woven into children's literature. The original tale wasn't meant to inspire or comfort. It was designed as a warning, a coded message about horrors too terrible to name directly. What lies beneath this seemingly innocent fairy tale is a historical tapestry of sexual violence, medical exploitation, and psychological trauma so disturbing that its true origins have been systematically obscured for centuries. The real Sleeping Beauty isn't about love conquering evil. It's about power, violation, and the silencing of victims. Picture a dimly lit chamber in 17th century France. Candles flicker as courtiers lean forward, their faces both horrified and captivated as they listen to a tale not meant for children's ears. This is where our journey begins, not in the realm of fantasy, but in the all too real world of historical atrocity and the stories created to process unspeakable trauma. The first written version of what we now call Sleeping Beauty appeared in 1634, penned by Giambattista Basile in his collection Il Pentamerone, titled Sun, Moon, and Talia. This early version contains no fairy godmothers, no spinning wheels, no true love's kiss. Instead, we find something far more disturbing. In Basile's tale, a nobleman discovers a sleeping maiden named Talia, who has fallen into a death-like slumber after a splinter of flax lodged under her fingernail. Finding her unconscious and unable to wake her, he does not kiss her. He rapes her. Talia remains unconscious throughout her violation and the subsequent birth of twins, conceived while she was in her coma-like state. One of the infants, seeking to nurse, sucks on her finger and inadvertently removes the splinter, awakening her. When she wakes, she finds herself a mother without ever having experienced consciousness during the conception or birth of her children. This isn't a narrative anomaly or a dark reimagining. This is the original tale, the foundation upon which the sanitized modern version was built. The violation of an unconscious woman, the theft of her consent and autonomy, the profound trauma of awakening to find your body has been used without your knowledge. These elements aren't perversions of the tale. They are the tale itself. Historian Maria Tatar of Harvard University has extensively documented how these early versions weren't whispered secrets, but widely shared narratives. The horror they contain wasn't hidden. It was the point. When Charles Perrault adapted the story in 1697 for his Tales of Mother Goose, he softened some elements but retained the core narrative of a young woman rendered unconscious and defenseless. The question we must ask is not why early versions were so dark, but why modern society has gone to such lengths to sanitize and obscure these origins. But to truly understand the disturbing reality behind Sleeping Beauty, we need to look beyond the literary evolution to the historical context that birthed these narratives. What was happening in the 16th and 17th century Europe that would inspire tales of young women rendered unconscious and violated? The answer leads us to one of the darkest chapters in medical history. Court records from across Europe during this period document a disturbing pattern of what we would now recognize as medical rape. Physicians and so-called healers would administer soporific substances to young women, rendering them unconscious supposedly for medical procedures, only to sexually assault them while they were insensate. The archives of the Parliament of Paris contain multiple cases of practitioners charged with such crimes, men who claimed to be treating female hysteria or uterine displacement through unconsciousness and subsequent physical manipulation. A particularly well-documented case from 1594 involves a physician named Guillaume de la Vienne who was executed for administering sleeping draughts to at least 7 young women before assaulting them. Several victims reported awakening with no memory of what had occurred, only to discover months later that they were pregnant. This pattern, unconsciousness, violation, unexpected pregnancy, mirrors the narrative of Basile's Talia with chilling precision. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss theorized that folk tales function as cultural processing mechanisms, ways for societies to grapple with widespread trauma too terrible to address directly. The Sleeping Beauty narrative wasn't fantasy. It was a coded documentation of real crimes occurring across Europe, transmitted through story as both warning and witness. The spindle that pricks the princess's finger in later versions, the object that induces her unnatural sleep, deserves special attention. In medieval and Renaissance medical practice, spindle-like instruments were commonly used in gynecological examinations and procedures. These implements, often made of bone or wood and shaped to a point, were tools of a medical establishment that viewed female bodies as mysterious territories to be explored and conquered. The spindle in Sleeping Beauty isn't merely a convenient household object, it's a direct reference to the medical instruments used to violate women's bodies under the guise of treatment. Archival records from the Royal College of Physicians document the use of such implements alongside soporific substances. A 1617 treatise by physician Thomas Vicary describes administering sleeping draughts of poppy and mandragora before conducting examinations of the female regions, using bone implements he describes as not unlike the spindle of a weaver. The connection between these medical practices and the imagery of Sleeping Beauty is not coincidental. It is deliberate symbolic encoding. But the horror doesn't stop at the initial violation. The awakening itself carries equally disturbing historical resonances. Consider the psychological trauma of women who awakened from these drug-induced states to discover their bodies had been used without their consent or knowledge. Court testimonies describe victims experiencing what we would now recognize as severe dissociative disorders, a psychological severing from their own bodies as they attempted to process what had happened to them. Many reported feeling as though they had slept through their own lives or were living in a waking dream, phrases that echo the uncanny liminality of the Sleeping Beauty narrative. The psychological concept of dissociation wasn't clinically understood until centuries later, but these historical accounts describe its classic symptoms: detachment, emotional numbing, and a sense of unreality. Sleeping Beauty's 100-year sleep isn't merely a magical curse, it's a metaphorical representation of psychological withdrawal following sexual trauma, a state well documented in victims throughout history, and what of the prince who awakens her? In the sanitized Disney version, he is the hero, the savior who restores the princess to life through true love. But in historical context, he represents something far more sinister: the societal expectation that a good marriage could somehow erase or redeem sexual violation. Historical records from this period are filled with cases of women who, after experiencing sexual assault, were pressured or forced to marry their attackers to restore family honor. The happy ending of royal marriage isn't a resolution. It's a continuation of the violation through different means. The archives of the Diocese of Canterbury contain numerous applications for marriage licenses following cases of defilement, many specifically noting that the bride was previously rendered insensible before her dishonor. Church authorities frequently pressured families to arrange these marriages, considering them the only way to restore social order. The prince's awakening kiss transforms in this light from an act of love to one of institutional complicity in trauma. The Sleeping Beauty narrative becomes even darker when we examine the role of the older women in the tale, the fairies or wise women who either curse the princess or try to protect her. These figures have direct historical parallels in the midwives and female healers who were increasingly persecuted during Europe's witch trial era, precisely the period when these tales were being transcribed and formalized. Midwives possessed knowledge of herbs that could ease pain, induce sleep, or terminate unwanted pregnancies. This knowledge made them both essential to communities and dangerous to the male medical establishment that was consolidating its power. Court records from witch trials frequently mention accusations of unnatural sleep and corruption of maidens, language that mirrors the Sleeping Beauty narrative with disturbing precision. The 1634 trial of midwife Anne Hutchins in Somerset accused her of administering sleeping potions to young women that left them vulnerable to defilers. What the records reveal, however, is that Hutchins was likely providing early forms of anesthesia for painful procedures, knowledge that male physicians would later claim as their own innovation. The evil fairy who curses Sleeping Beauty can be read as a direct demonization of these female practitioners whose medical knowledge threatened the emerging male medical establishment. But perhaps the most devastating element of the historical Sleeping Beauty narrative is what happens to her body during her unconscious state. In Basile's version, Talia gives birth while still asleep, her body functioning without her conscious participation. This element reflects a deeply disturbing historical reality: the use of unconscious or dead women's bodies for medical experimentation and training. Medical archives from the 16th and 17th centuries document the practice of male physicians using the bodies of unconscious women, particularly those who were poor, imprisoned, or otherwise marginalized, to practice surgical techniques and study female anatomy. The University of Padua's medical records describe pregnant women rendered unconscious through opium derivatives so that physicians could observe labor contractions without patient resistance. More disturbing still, court records from Bologna in 1612 document a physician who deliberately kept women sedated through childbirth to study the process unhindered by the mother's cries or movements. The sleeping princess, her body continuing its biological processes without her conscious participation, becomes, in this light, not a fantastical curse but a documented medical atrocity, one committed against countless unnamed women throughout history. The castle surrounded by thorns isn't just a fairy tale obstacle. It's a metaphor for the institutional protections that have historically shielded medical abuses from scrutiny or accountability. These historical realities transform our understanding of even the most innocent-seeming elements of the tale. The 100 years of sleep prescribed in later versions corresponds with actual medical case studies of women who, following traumatic assaults, entered catatonic states lasting months or even years. The Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris documented multiple cases of sleeping maidens, young women who, after sexual assaults, entered prolonged dissociative states from which they could not be roused. One case from 1695 describes a young woman who slept without waking for nearly 2 years following an attack, awakening only when moved to a new location, a narrative that parallels Sleeping Beauty with eerie precision. The forest that grows around the castle in many versions represents another layer of historical trauma: the social isolation imposed on victims of sexual violence. Historical records show that women who reported assaults were often removed from society, sent to convents or rural relatives, their experiences deliberately erased from community memory. The thorns aren't protecting the princess. They're enforcing her isolation and silencing her story. This pattern of institutional silencing continues into the modern evolution of the tale, when the Brothers Grimm included Little Briar Rose in their collection in 1812. They maintained the sleep and awakening, but removed the explicit sexual violation. By Disney's 1959 animated adaptation, all traces of the original trauma narrative had been systematically erased, replaced with a sanitized romance that bears almost no resemblance to the historical warning tale. This progressive sanitization wasn't an improvement. It was an erasure of women's historical suffering and the warnings embedded in the original narrative. The modernization of Sleeping Beauty represents one of the most comprehensive acts of historical gaslighting in popular culture, a deliberate obfuscation of centuries of documented trauma. By transforming a tale about violation and institutional complicity into a romantic fantasy, modern adaptations don't just miss the point, they actively participate in the same patterns of silencing and erasure that the original tale was created to expose. What makes this erasure particularly disturbing is that the patterns of abuse documented in the original Sleeping Beauty narrative never actually ended. Medical abuse of unconscious patients continues into the present day. Between 2000 and 2022, medical licensing boards across the United States reported over 200 cases of practitioners sexually assaulting anesthetized patients. The historical warning encoded in Sleeping Beauty remains urgently relevant. yet we have stripped it of its power by transforming it into a romantic fantasy. The psychological dimensions of the tale take on even greater significance when examined through the lens of trauma studies. The sleeping princess exists in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor dead, trapped in an in-between state that perfectly mirrors the dissociative freeze response documented in trauma victims. This isn't coincidental symbolism. It's a precise psychological portrait drawn from observed reality. Contemporary trauma researchers like Bessel van der Kolk have documented how the body records traumatic experiences even when the conscious mind cannot access them, a phenomenon chillingly paralleled in Talia's body continuing to function, even giving birth, while her consciousness remains suspended. The original Sleeping Beauty narrative contains one of the most accurate pre-modern depictions of trauma response ever recorded, yet this aspect has been completely erased from contemporary versions. And what of the curse itself? In modern versions, it's a simple act of revenge by a slighted fairy. But historical context reveals a more disturbing truth. The curse of unconsciousness parallels a specific form of social control used against troublesome women throughout European history. Court and asylum records from the 16th to 19th centuries document the practice of administering long-term sedatives to women who violated social norms or challenged male authority. The curse of endless sleep wasn't magical fantasy. It was documented medical practice used to silence and control women. The archives of the Royal Bethlehem Hospital in London contain admission records for dozens of women diagnosed with excessive female passion or unsuitable independence of mind, who were subjected to regimens of continuous sedation, some lasting years. One case from 1762 describes a young woman kept in a continuous sleep state for over 7 months for the crime of rejecting an arranged marriage. The curse that befalls the princess isn't supernatural. It's historical reality coded as fantasy, but the horror doesn't stop with the historical origins. The modern sanitization of Sleeping Beauty represents something equally disturbing: our collective cultural unwillingness to confront historical atrocity by transforming a narrative about medical abuse, sexual violence, and institutional silencing into a romantic fairy tale suitable for children. We haven't merely changed a story. We have participated in the very pattern of denial and erasure that allowed these abuses to continue unchecked for centuries. French philosopher Michel Foucault extensively documented how power operates not just through what is said, but through what is systematically unsaid. The knowledge that is deliberately obscured or rewritten. The transformation of Sleeping Beauty from trauma narrative to romance represents precisely this operation of power, the erasure of women's historical suffering in service of a more comfortable, less challenging narrative. And once you understand the true origins of Sleeping Beauty, you'll realize the implications extend far beyond a single fairy tale. The same patterns of sanitization and erasure can be found across our cultural landscape. Historical traumas repackaged as entertainment, real suffering transformed into palatable fantasy. This isn't merely about literary history, it's about how societies process, or fail to process, their darkest chapters. Picture for a moment the original audience for Basile's tale, courtiers and nobles who would have recognized the coded references to real cases of abuse happening within their social circles. The tale wasn't escapist fantasy. It was a way of speaking the unspeakable, of documenting crimes that official records wouldn't acknowledge. By sanitizing these narratives, we haven't improved them. We've stripped them of their power as historical witness and warning. The thorns surrounding Sleeping Beauty's castle weren't meant to be overcome. They were meant to stand as a warning, a barrier signaling danger. By transforming them into a simple obstacle that true love can conquer, we've inverted the original message. We've taken a tale that warns this territory is dangerous, marked by trauma and violation, and transformed it into one that says persistence and the right intentions can overcome any boundary. Consider the implications of that inversion and what it teaches about consent, trauma, and boundaries. This pattern of inversion appears throughout the modernization process. The unconscious princess, originally depicted as a victim of violation, becomes romanticized as a passive beauty waiting for activation by male intervention. Her lack of consent, originally the horror at the center of the tale, is transformed into a romantic convention. This isn't merely sanitization, it's a complete ethical reversal that normalizes and romanticizes the very behaviors the original tale was created to condemn. What was once a warning about the vulnerability of the unconscious body becomes, in modern versions, an endorsement of taking action upon that same unconscious body without consent. True Love's Kiss, celebrated as romantic in Disney's version, represents in historical context the very violation the original tale condemned. This isn't a minor change in narrative details. It's a fundamental ethical inversion that normalizes precisely what the original tale sought to expose as horrific. The implications of this inversion continue to reverberate through contemporary culture. Modern discussions of consent frequently reference Sleeping Beauty as a problematic example, yet few realize they are identifying precisely what the original tale was created to criticize. The warning has been so completely transformed into its opposite that we now must warn against the warning itself. And here's where it gets truly disturbing. This pattern of inversion isn't unique to Sleeping Beauty. Across our cultural landscape, narratives created to document and warn against historical trauma have been systematically sanitized and inverted. What were once coded testimonies of real suffering have been transformed into entertainment that often romanticizes the very abuses they were created to condemn. This isn't accidental. It's a pattern of institutional silencing that has persisted for centuries, but the darkness persists beneath the sanitized surface. Like the sleeping princess herself, the truth lies dormant but not dead, waiting for those willing to look beyond the romanticized facade to the historical reality beneath. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The innocent fairy tale transforms before your eyes into what it always was: a coded historical document of medical abuse, institutional silencing, and the violation of unconscious bodies. The next time you encounter Sleeping Beauty, whether in a children's book, a ballet, or a film, look past the romantic trappings to the historical warning that lies beneath. See the spindle not as a magical implement, but as a medical instrument used to violate. See the sleep not as an enchantment, but as a documented form of medical abuse. See the prince not as a savior, but as the embodiment of a society that offered marriage as the only resolution for violation. See the castle not as a fairy tale setting, but as the institutional structures that protected perpetrators and silenced victims. What makes the true origins of Sleeping Beauty particularly haunting isn't just the darkness they contain, but what they reveal about our collective willingness to forget. The sanitization wasn't accidental. It was deliberate erasure of women's historical suffering, an institutional silencing that parallels the very crimes the original tale sought to expose. We haven't merely changed a story. We've participated in the same pattern of denial and erasure that allowed these abuses to continue unchecked. The real curse isn't the one that befalls the princess. It's our cultural amnesia, our willingness to forget the warnings our ancestors tried to encode for future generations. It's our preference for comforting lies over disturbing truths. The Sleeping Beauty isn't the princess in the tale. It's the historical truth we've collectively chosen to let slumber undisturbed, surrounded by thorns of denial, sanitization, and willful forgetting. And perhaps that is the most disturbing origin of all.